Oliver sat quietly at his desk, twirling his pencil between his fingers as his classmates chatted around him. It was just another ordinary day in his 8th grade classroom in California. The sun streamed through the tall windows, casting golden streaks onto the whiteboard where their teacher, Mr. Callahan, was writing something about Newton's laws. Science had always been Oliver's favorite subject. He loved everything about space, rockets, and the universe, but he had long learned to keep most of that enthusiasm to himself. The conversation among the students had drifted to an upcoming project on space exploration. Mr. Callahan had given them free rein to choose a topic related to space, and naturally, everyone started discussing what they would pick. Some were talking about Mars, black holes, and astronauts, while others debated if aliens were real. That's when one of the students, Ryan Carter, scoffed loudly. "NASA's just a bunch of guys sitting in a room pressing buttons," he said dismissively. "It's not like they actually do anything cool." Oliver, without thinking, finally spoke up. "That's not true. NASA does a lot of important work." Ryan turned toward him with a smirk. "Oh, yeah? And how would you know?" Oliver hesitated for a second, then said, "Because my dad works at NASA." For a moment, there was silence. Then, almost in unison, the entire class erupted into laughter. It wasn't the kind of laughter that comes with a shared joke. It was mocking, disbelieving, and a little cruel. Ryan was the first to recover. "Yeah, right," he snorted. "And my uncle's an astronaut." Even Mr. Callahan raised an eyebrow. Though he didn't say anything, Oliver felt his face grow warm. He wanted to argue, to tell them that his father was an aerospace engineer, that he worked on actual spacecraft, that he had been part of teams that launched missions into space. But he knew it wouldn't matter. Ryan leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "Man, you don't have to make up stuff just to sound cool." Oliver clenched his fists under his desk. He knew his dad's work was real, and it was more than cool, it was groundbreaking. But no one would believe him. Then, just as the laughter began to fade and the lesson was about to resume, there was a knock at the classroom door. Mr. Callahan glanced up, frowning slightly, and walked over to open it. A man stepped in, tall and wearing a crisp navy blue polo with the unmistakable NASA logo on the chest. His hair was neatly combed, and he carried himself with quiet confidence. "Excuse me," he said in a calm, professional voice. "I'm looking for Oliver Bennett." Oliver's stomach flipped as every head in the classroom turned toward him. Mr. Callahan blinked in surprise. "That would be Oliver, right there." The man smiled warmly and took a few steps forward. "Hey, kiddo," he said, his voice softer now. Oliver's heart pounded. "Dad!" The room was dead silent. The laughter had completely vanished, replaced with stunned expressions. Ryan's mouth hung open slightly, and even Mr. Callahan seemed at a loss for words. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Oliver's dad continued, glancing around the room. "Oliver forgot his lunch at home, so I thought I'd drop it off." He held up a neatly packed lunch bag, the kind Oliver's mom always made for him. "But since I'm here, I suppose I could answer any questions about NASA." There was another long pause before Ryan finally managed to sputter, "Wait, you actually work for NASA?" Oliver's dad smiled. "I do. I'm an aerospace engineer. I work on spacecraft design and propulsion systems. It's a little more complicated than just pressing buttons." The silence in the room was thick. Then, suddenly, the questions began spilling out. "Have you ever met an astronaut? Do you know about secret space missions? Is NASA working on a moon base?" Even Mr. Callahan seemed eager to listen. Oliver sat there, watching as his father effortlessly captivated the entire class with his knowledge, his calm explanations, and his obvious passion for space exploration. For the first time, Oliver didn't feel embarrassed or ignored. Instead, he felt proud of his dad and of everything he did. And as he met Ryan's wide-eyed stare, Oliver allowed himself the smallest, most satisfying smile as the questions kept coming. Oliver's dad answered each one with patience and enthusiasm. He explained how NASA was developing new propulsion systems to make space travel more efficient. He talked about upcoming missions, the possibility of humans setting foot on Mars in their lifetime, and the technological advances that have been made in space exploration. He even mentioned how satellites help with everyday things like weather forecasting and GPS navigation, things most people took for granted. Ryan, who had spent the last 10 minutes in stunned silence, finally found his voice. Wait, so you actually build rockets? Oliver's dad chuckled. Not exactly. I work with a team of engineers who design and improve the engines that power rockets. Think of it like a really advanced version of a car engine. Except instead of gasoline, we use liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen to create the thrust needed to escape Earth's gravity. The entire class leaned in, hanging on to his every word. Even Mr. Callahan, who had been teaching science for over 2 decades, seemed intrigued. So, when we hear about launches on TV, there's a chance you helped design part of that rocket? He asked. Oliver's dad nodded. Yes, some of the rockets you've seen, like the ones that send probes to Mars or satellites into orbit, were built with input from teams like mine. A few students gasped. One of the girls, Jessica, turned to Oliver. That's actually really cool, she admitted. Oliver, who had spent years being teased for his love of space, felt something shift. The way they were looking at him had changed. No one was laughing anymore. Then someone else raised a hand. Have you ever seen classified NASA stuff? Like, do aliens exist? His dad smiled but shook his head. There are a lot of rumors about NASA hiding aliens. But trust me, we'd be shouting it from the rooftops if we ever found real proof. Right now, we're still searching. We do know there are billions of planets in the universe, some of which could have conditions suitable for life. So while we haven't found aliens yet, that doesn't mean they aren't out there. Another student, Emily, spoke up. What's the coolest thing you've ever worked on? Oliver's dad paused, considering the question. I think one of the most exciting projects I was a part of was helping design components for the Artemis program, the mission to return humans to the moon. The class murmured in excitement. Mr. Callahan's eyes widened. That's history in the making, he said. We haven't had astronauts on the moon since the Apollo missions. That's right. Oliver's dad agreed. And this time, we're going back to stay. We're working on lunar bases, sustainable energy sources, and eventually using the moon as a stepping stone for deeper space exploration, like Mars. Ryan, who had been so dismissive before, was now staring in open amazement. Okay, that's actually insane, he admitted. Like real-life Star Wars stuff. Oliver smirked. He had been saying that for years. Then his dad glanced at the clock. I should probably let you all get back to your lesson, he said. But I just wanted to drop off Oliver's lunch. He handed the bag to his son and ruffled his hair lightly. See you at home, kiddo. As he turned to leave, Mr. Callahan cleared his throat. Mr. Bennett, I know you're busy, but if you ever have time, I think our students would love to hear more about your work. Oliver's dad smiled. I'd be happy to. As he walked out, the room was silent for a moment. Then, all at once, the students burst into conversation, bombarding Oliver with questions. Dude, your dad is amazing. Why didn't you tell us? Can he bring us to NASA? Have you ever seen a rocket launch in real life? For the first time in his life, Oliver wasn't just a space nerd. He wasn't the kid people laughed at. He was a kid with a dad who built rockets. And for the first time, he didn't feel embarrassed about loving space. As Mr. Callahan tried to restore order to the classroom, Oliver leaned back in his chair, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. The stars had always been his passion. Now, it seemed they were finally listening. As the class finally settled down, Oliver sat there, still buzzing from the unexpected turn of events. His dad had just walked into the classroom and flipped his entire social status in less than 10 minutes. He glanced over at Ryan, who was usually the loudest voice when it came to teasing him about his interests. But now, Ryan wasn't smirking or rolling his eyes. Instead, he looked deep in thought, like he was still processing everything. Mr. Callahan tapped his marker against a whiteboard to get everyone's attention. All right, everyone calm down. I know that was an exciting surprise, but we do still have a lesson to finish. Some students groaned, but a few, including Jessica and Emily, raised their hands. Mr. Callahan, since we're already talking about space, can we pick our projects based on what Oliver's dad was saying? Like, the Artemis mission or Mars exploration? Mr. Callahan smiled. I don't see why not. In fact, that's a great idea. He turned to Oliver. Oliver, would you be willing to help some of your classmates if they have questions about NASA's missions? Oliver hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Yeah, sure. It felt strange. A few hours ago, he was just a kid who got ignored when he talked about space. Now, people actually wanted his help. As Mr. Callahan went back to his lesson, Oliver could feel the occasional glance from his classmates. Ryan, in particular, kept looking over like he wanted to say something. Finally, after about 10 minutes, he leaned over and whispered, Hey, sorry about earlier. Oliver blinked. Ryan never apologized for anything. What? Ryan rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. I mean, I thought you were making it up, you know? Like, people say stuff to sound cool all the time. But your dad, man, he's legit. He let out a short laugh. I still can't believe I said NASA was just a bunch of guys pressing buttons. Oliver shrugged. I get it. A lot of people don't really know what NASA actually does. Ryan nodded. Yeah, anyway, I was thinking of doing my project on the Artemis mission. Since your dad worked on it, maybe you could help me out? Oliver was so shocked that for a second, he didn't know what to say. Ryan Carter, the same kid who had spent the last 2 years teasing him about being a space geek, was asking for his help. Yeah, Oliver said finally. Sure. The rest of the class flew by. At lunch, for the first time ever, Oliver wasn't sitting alone. Jessica and Emily sat with him, along with a few other classmates who had never paid him much attention before. They bombarded him with questions about space, NASA, and what it was like growing up with a dad who built rockets. By the time the last bell rang, Oliver was still trying to wrap his head around everything that had happened. He grabbed his backpack and headed toward the front of the school, where his dad was waiting in the car. As he climbed in, his dad smiled. So, how was the rest of your day? Oliver let out a breath and shook his head, still in disbelief. Honestly, probably the best day of my life. His dad chuckled. Glad I could help. As they pulled away from the school, Oliver looked out the window, watching the sky as the sun began to set. The stars would be visible soon, those same distant lights that had fascinated him since he was little. And now, for the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone in that fascination. For years, he had dreamed about working at NASA, about following in his dad's footsteps. Now, as he sat there, he realized something important. He wasn't just dreaming about it anymore. He was on his way. That night, Oliver sat at his desk, staring at his laptop screen. He had been researching space missions for years, but this time it felt different. Instead of being just another personal obsession, it was something his classmates actually wanted to learn about. For the first time, he wasn't just a weird space kid. He was a guy people turned to for answers. His mind kept replaying the moment when Ryan had asked for his help. Ryan, of all people. The same guy who had once laughed at him for watching rocket launches during lunch breaks. The same guy who had once mocked him for wearing a NASA hoodie to school. And now, Ryan wanted to work with him on a project. Oliver pulled up a NASA article on the Artemis program and started taking notes. He wanted to be prepared, not just for himself, but for everyone who would be coming to him with questions. He had always known this stuff, but now he had a reason to really perfect it. He had a chance to prove that this wasn't just a hobby. It was his future. Downstairs, he could hear his parents talking in the kitchen. His dad's voice carried up the stairs. Yeah, it was pretty funny. The whole class laughed at him at first. His mom's voice followed, slightly concerned. Oh no, was he okay? There was a pause. Then his dad laughed. I think he's more than okay. By the time I left, the whole class wanted to talk to him. I don't think Oliver's ever had a day like that before. Oliver smiled to himself. His dad was right. He hadn't. The next morning at school, things felt different. As he walked down the hallway, people actually acknowledged him. Not just his usual few friends, but other students who had never spoken to him before. Hey, Oliver, I looked up that Artemis mission. It's crazy how they're going to build a moon base. Dude, your dad is awesome. I told my parents about him, and even they were impressed. Can you explain how rocket fuel works? I want to do my project on propulsion. Oliver had never been popular. He wasn't sure he wanted to be, either. But this, being respected for something he actually cared about, this felt right. In science class, Mr. Callahan officially announced the space exploration project. After yesterday's little surprise visit, I think it's safe to say we have an expert among us, he said, looking at Oliver. So if anyone needs help, I think Oliver might be the best person to ask. Oliver felt his face warm as the class chuckled, but this time it wasn't in mockery. It was real, genuine. When they split into groups, Oliver found himself sitting with Ryan, Jessica, Emily, and a few others who wanted to work on Artemis. He pulled up his notes and began explaining how the new SLS rockets worked, how astronauts would live on the moon, and how this was just the beginning of NASA's plan for Mars. As he spoke, he realized something. This wasn't just about the project anymore. This was his moment. He wasn't just a kid who loved space. He was a kid who knew space. As the days passed, Oliver found himself busier than ever. Students who had never even acknowledged him before were suddenly asking him for help with their projects. He spent his lunches in the library, surrounded by classmates who wanted to know more about Artemis, Mars, and deep space travel. Even Ryan, who used to mock him, now seemed genuinely interested. One afternoon, Ryan slid into the seat next to Oliver as he worked on their project. So, I was thinking, he said, tapping his pencil against his notebook. If we're going to do this right, we should probably add some visuals, you know? Like actual NASA footage. Oliver grinned. That's a great idea. NASA has a ton of public resources. We can download videos of rocket launches, moon landings, and even animations of future missions. Ryan nodded. Yeah, and maybe we can make a model or something. You know, like a 3D model of the Artemis rocket. Oliver's excitement grew. That would be awesome. We could use cardboard and 3D printed parts to make it as realistic as possible. Ryan smirked. See? Now you're talking my language. As the project came together, something unexpected happened. Oliver and Ryan actually started getting along. It turned out Ryan wasn't just some loudmouth who made fun of people. He was actually pretty creative, and once he stopped teasing Oliver, he had some great ideas. One day after school, Ryan walked home with Oliver, something that had never happened before. You know, Ryan said as they crossed the street, I used to think space was kind of boring, but now it's actually pretty cool. Oliver raised an eyebrow. That's a big change from NASA. It's just a bunch of guys pressing buttons. Ryan laughed. Yeah, well, I was an idiot. Turns out, I just didn't know anything about it. Oliver smirked. Welcome to the club. As they reached Oliver's house, his dad was in the garage working on a project. He looked up and waved. Hey, Oliver, who's your friend? Ryan hesitated, then extended his hand. Ryan, sir. Nice to meet you. Oliver's dad shook his hand. Nice to meet you too, Ryan. You guys working on your project? Yeah, Ryan said. And, I was wondering, do you think you could tell us more about how the Artemis rocket actually works? Like, the engineering behind it? Oliver's dad smiled. Of course. Come on inside. I'll show you some cool stuff. That evening, as Ryan listened intently to Oliver's dad explain the complexities of rocket science, Oliver realized something. His world had shifted. For the first time in his life, he wasn't alone in his love for space. He had people who actually cared. He had people who listened. And maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Oliver's life kept changing in ways he had never expected. He had always been the kid who stayed in the background, the one who people ignored unless they were teasing him. But now, his classmates actually valued what he had to say. His group's project on Artemis was coming together better than he could have imagined. They had gathered NASA videos, built a scale model of the SLS rocket, and even created a digital presentation that broke down the mission stages, from launch to lunar landing. Ryan had turned out to be a great partner, using his artistic skills to design sleek slides and even sketching a future lunar base. One afternoon, as they were putting the final touches on their project in the library, Jessica leaned over and tapped Oliver's notebook. Hey, have you ever thought about becoming an astronaut? Oliver blinked. Me? An astronaut? Jessica nodded. Yeah, I mean, you know everything about space, and your dad works for NASA. It seems like something you'd be perfect for. Oliver had thought about it before. What kid who loved space hadn't? But he had never really considered it seriously. I don't know, he admitted. I always thought I'd be more of an engineer like my dad. Ryan, who was adjusting the rocket model, looked up. Dude, you make a great astronaut. You're smart, you love space, and you actually know how all this stuff works. Plus, imagine how cool it would be if one day you're the one walking on the moon while we're watching on TV. Oliver laughed, but the thought lingered in his mind. That night, after finishing his homework, he pulled up NASA's website and started reading about the requirements for becoming an astronaut. He learned about the intense training, the physical tests, and the years of study required. It was daunting, but also exciting. He glanced at a photo of the Artemis astronauts, the men and women who would one day set foot on the moon. Could he really be one of them? The idea sent a thrill through him. The day of the class presentations finally arrived. Oliver's group was one of the last to go, and by then, the excitement in the room had built up. Mr. Callahan had been praising the other groups, but Oliver could tell that their project was on a different level. When they started presenting, Oliver spoke with confidence. He explained the mission, the technology, and the future of space travel, answering questions with ease. Ryan and the others backed him up, adding their own insights. But Oliver was the one who held the room's attention. When they finished, the class erupted into applause. Even Mr. Callahan looked impressed. That, he said, was one of the best presentations I've seen in all my years of teaching. Well done. As Oliver sat back down, Ryan grinned and nudged him. Told you, you're a natural. For the first time, Oliver believed it. Later that evening, as he sat outside in his backyard, staring up at the night sky, his dad came and sat beside him. You did good today, his dad said. Mr. Callahan emailed me to say how impressed he was. Oliver smiled. Thanks, Dad. His dad looked up at the stars. So what's next? Oliver thought about it for a moment. I think I want to do more. Maybe not just study space, but actually be part of it. His dad nodded, a proud smile on his face. Then go for it. I believe in you. Oliver looked up at the vast sky above him, filled with stars and endless possibilities. For the first time, he wasn't just dreaming about space. He was reaching for it.